Hey, this is Steve Orlando. I'm here with another episode of a conversation series we're calling Who's Got the Juice? Me talking to folks I've known from my career as a comic book writer and former spirits representative and manager for PM Spirits, which is why we're all here today. My story quickly, if this is your first episode, I took 20 plus years trying to break into comics like most people with an English degree. During that time, I needed a job to pay the rent. And so what started for me first as a triage decision, working in spirits retail, became a passion over time, which led me from working in upstate New York to working in the Hudson Valley to meeting PM Spirits, meeting Nicola Palazzi, who started this company. And as I got into comics more full-time, working with them at the same time as a spirits representative, two freelance positions that let you mold your Gumby-like schedules together. And it was all very helpful. And I did that until I was able to go full-time in comics, which was probably about 4 to 5 years ago. Since then, I've been in touch with Nicola. I still love PM Spirits. I still love what they're about, which is to say, upstart company that focuses only on craft spirits, only on liquors, things made by real humans with as little intervention as possible between the barrel and the bottle. So I like to think of them as an underdog story. People try to do something a little different. Many have said that about myself. And so when I spoke to Nicola about what we could do to keep in touch and keep working with the company, it was this conversation series. It's a way to talk about people's journeys on their way in different industries and sort of see how these worlds connect, because what we found in past conversations is spirits are a chance to share a moment with someone else. They bring people together and there's connections between what might be thought of as disparate industries in ways you'd never expect. So very excited today to talk to Shea Fontana, one of my friends from the Comic-Con circuit, but I'll fully admit, someone I don't know as well as other folks that we've spoken with on this conversation series, and that makes me all the more excited to discover stuff together. So Shea, thanks for coming on. It's great to have you on.
Thank you for having me. I am excited to do this. This is a fun one. I don't usually get to drink during my interviews.
I think you're doing the wrong interviews then, especially during the pandemic. But yes, I'm really excited. We've spoken to all different sorts of folks, former executives on this conversation series, satanic pro wrestlers, and everything in between, and much more to come, upcoming. But with that said, you have had just a wild backstory. For folks that don't know, I would say it's safe to say you're probably most well-known these days for the DC superhero girls. Every year they come out, some of the best-selling graphic novels of the year, both in print and then also, of course, in animation with original direct-to-video movies and also merchandising. So it's a juggernaut, and it's connected so well because of your work. But that said, I think the first thing I always like to talk to people about is how you got to where you were. I obviously had a whole career before I was into comics, and that journey sort of makes us who we are and informs the way we work today. So how did you get to be the Shea Fontana I'm talking to today?
Well, ever since I was a little kid, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I was the kid who came into class after you were assigned to write a story, and I had like a chapter book that I had written overnight. I just really loved the process. I guess in some ways was very naturally drawn to this sort of storytelling industry. When I first started college, I thought I would be a journalist because that's the only kind of writing as a career I knew was possible. I grew up in a very small town, very far from, anyone in showbiz or anyone that had a career as a comic book writer. And so I saw that there was a newspaper and there were people who were employed as writers by the word for that newspaper. So maybe that was something that I could do. And as I got started in my journalism classes, I would go home at night and watch a lot of cartoons. And at some point I realized, hey, these cartoons have a written by credit. Maybe that's a kind of writing that I could do instead. So I, from there pretty quickly was like, all right, went to my college advisor. I would like to change my emphasis. I was a communications major, but they had different emphases, I don't know, emphases that you could do.
Everything is a word.
Yeah.
Right.
And I changed to animation. So I very quickly just realized that really was my passion. I was the kid who, they always say execs in the animation world will tell you that girls don't watch cartoons as teenagers, but I was the teenage girl who was watching cartoons, who was just voraciously taking in that content. So at that point, my senior year of college, I interned with the Jim Henson Company. Got to see some of the awesome Creature Shop stuff. Obviously, I think Jim Henson was an absolute genius. The Muppets were so inspirational for me and so formative for my sense of humor. It was just so amazing to be able to do that. And then I, from there, started as an assistant at an animation company. I pretty quickly was able to do some script writing from that position. And then I had the classic problem of trying to get a second job. They say getting your first writing job's hard. I found getting my second writing job was much harder. So it was about 3 or 4 years after that before I started regularly getting writing jobs and was able to transition out of more the day job, kind of production assistant, to I did some marketing, so like social media sites. I was doing their social media for some different kids animation companies, and became a full-time writer in animation. So that's how I got here, and I never looked back.
I mean, it's everyone's journey seems to be parallel, but also different, and so I'm always interested to ask people how they got sort of from A to B. Because it is, people love to say in comics that, there's every time whatever door you take to get into comics, well, it closes behind you and it doesn't open again. So for everybody like me who I started going to conventions when I was 12 and trying to hustle jobs, and people just thought that was quaint back then. But by the time I was in my mid-20s, it was more realistic. But there's people that have a chance encounter and make a connection with an exec or another creator, and things build from there. It's the thing about creative arts that is fascinating to me is that you're always sort of in it, even if for the 10 years I was selling spirits, I was still writing. Like you're always in it. It's just that exciting moment when it can take to the forefront. So I got to ask, just because I know that I know that there's actually a strong interest in animation. With the PM Spirits owner, Captain Cognac, what were your cartoons as a kid?
The 90s Nickelodeon lineup, Hey Arnold, Angry Beavers, Doug, just really, but I would say, with that said, most importantly, The Simpsons. Like, that was really such an experience as a kid. Like, it was a family show. Our entire family, there's probably the one time a week our entire family sat down to do something together was watch The Simpsons. And it was one of those things that I have 3 older brothers. We could all, quote every episode of The Simpsons for probably the first 10 seasons. It's like, that was the moment. And I'm sure I've certainly talked about this with my therapist. Like, that's definitely such a big thing of why I'm so in love with animation and in love with that ability to connect with people and connect with families through your TV, is because of that experience when I was growing up.
It's funny. The thing that was stunning to me about The Simpsons recently, this is a true story, of 2 weeks ago, I was on what for me was a vacation, 4 days off, an hour away from my house. And my friends were watching the Plow King episode, probably one of the greatest, but that is not necessarily germane, as much as the fact that I realized that Homer Simpson for a long time apparently was younger than me. And that was a real big moment for me. I guess at some point, since I stopped watching regularly, they have said that he's in his early 40s now. But I was like, damn it, he's supposed to be like 34, 35. And I was like, wow, this is what's happened to me.
Right, because it was it a high school pregnancy with Marge, or was she just out of high school? Was that?
Wow, that's a wiki level question for someone to step away for a minute. But no, and then the kids, everybody's aging very slowly. They have to, otherwise you have like the Dick Grayson problem where eventually the kids are going to be older than the parents.
Right.
So no, it's funny. I was like, I know that Nicola is a big fan of Silverhawks, so I was hoping against hope that that we were going to be talking about Silverhawks and Thundercats. And apparently, the third show, which I believe is called Tiger Sharks, that I didn't know about until I was corrected
Ooh,
online. That was
I
all the same.
don't know.
I'm watching through the Thundercats reboot with my boyfriend right now, so I've been like deep in that world where everybody like has magic powers, and somehow like two lions can have a tiger for a son. It all makes a lot of sense.
Sure, yeah.
But regardless, no, it is always interesting to see what you come up on. I was also being into Simpsons, and to this day, I'm still living down being called boy by my father because of King of the Hill. So I blame my judge for that. But something you said recently on social media sort of popped into my head that's germane to this conversation. You know, not a lot of companies that work in spirits imports do what PM does. There's only one or two that only focus on liquors. You know, the margin isn't as high. It's people don't need it as regularly in theory because they're higher proof spirits, and it's more niche. You know, especially they started out just doing cognac, and then spread out to Armagnac, other French spirits. Now they have a full portfolio. It includes American bourbon and things that are more mainstream as an inroad. But for a while, it was really this sort of niche market, and it was a harder sell. So what am I talking about in regards to you? You were recently talking about how people have said, you had said early on in your career that you submitted to an agent, and the response was they don't get it.
Yes.
And I mean, listen, by the way, something I understand incredibly well. As a guy that just wants to tell strange, like Grant Morrison stories that are about ideas and not necessarily emotional arcs, I understand people giving me that response, probably more deserved in my case. But that said, now here you are, hundreds of jobs later, as you said. How do you go about building that brand and taking something that people don't get, something that people might say is niche or doesn't work, and then bringing it home, making it a home run, which you've clearly done, and I think that is something that is applicable to our spirits audience. So I wanted to ask you about
I think one of the important things that, especially as young writers, is hard to understand is that the world is very, very big. And there is, even if a very small audience likes you, you can survive off that audience. Like, it's really incredible, especially in the digital age, how niche we can be with our content, and really content where we were, you know, in the ratings 20 years ago, there's no on ABC or CBS. So it's really, the world has just gotten such a big appetite for content right now, and for those very specific kind of stories. And I think, like, one of the things that, you know, feeling very much like a weirdo growing up is that at some point you realize that there are a whole lot of other weirdos out there that are just like you and that understand what you're putting out there and what you're going through, and are able to, as a creative especially, support you in those endeavors, and are going to watch your content, are going to read your books, and are going to be your sort of fan base. And I don't know if I ever like specifically set out to be a brand or whatever, or find my audience. I think in a lot of ways it found me. And I was very lucky that I was coming up in a time where people were starting to think, oh, hey, maybe girls do like superheroes. Like, I think for us women who are in the industry, you know, the women who were at DC at the time that DC Superhero Girls got started, we were like, of course girls like superheroes. What are you guys talking about? We were the girls who were loving those superheroes. But it was finally a time when women were in the positions to hire and support and make budgets for that kind of content. And as well as there were just so many girls out there clamoring for great superhero content starring female leads. You know, so it's really interesting that, and I do feel very lucky that my time in the career coincided with that time was. I know there were so many women before me who were saying, hey, let's make some girl superheroes. Let's do this. We like very talented, incredible women creators who could have put out just great content. But, you know, the gatekeepers were there saying, no, we tried a girl hero once and it didn't quite work. So we're never going to do that again. You know, there's a lot within the entertainment industry that is so risk adverse. They look at the numbers of, oh, we invested this, like it's very much number driven and analytics driven. But we have been in this point where that's really shifting, and especially with a lot of the newer networks coming along, the digital platforms, the streaming networks, we've been able to find that they're taking some chances, and some of those chances have been massively successful. So it's a very exciting time in the industry right now.
No, absolutely, and it is. It's exciting to me to just as even as a queer voice outside of my own being a cisgender man, like having people to speak up to, working above you, that at least sort of understand in any way, sort of advocating for marginalized voices and pushing storytelling forward. There's a lot of labor that I think we don't even realize we do when we're pitching to people who aren't necessarily like us, that are just entrenched in power, that you don't even know it's there until it's gone, is what I found. Just have someone say, oh, well, I get where you're coming from. So that's an interesting thing that, that might be sort of it might be a shot in the dark, but I'll take that shot. This is something I know that women in the spirits industry also face, and probably first of all industries. Like let's get that out of the way. I know this myself because when I was working in upstate, I split the state with my friend Meryl, who's still with PM Spirits, and I know that there was a difference. I used to cover the entire upstate area myself, and God love Nick, New Yorker, no concept of how big upstate New York is. So the idea that I couldn't cover both Buffalo and Albany, despite them being nearly 7 hours apart, was a shock to him. So when Meryl came on, it was stunning to me, the different treatment that she received from accounts that had previously been very well for me. And of course, as the counterpoint, better treatment and accounts that hadn't performed well for me in the past. But I do know that there's that conception, much like anything else. How can a woman really know about spirits, which is obviously horseshit. We can obviously swear on this, by the way. And it is horseshit. But I have found, we're going to be tasting whiskey today. And I think that one of the ways I've seen within the industry, in the restaurant industry and related sort of hospitality, that I've seen my female peers sort of get that foothold is specifically, even if it's anecdotal, knowledge about whiskey, knowledge about sort of traditionally, quote unquote, male things, darker spirits and things like that, which again, this is all, it's just, cultural nonsense. Having said that, when we were talking about what you like, describe yourself as a whiskey fan, has it been an inroad for you in networking and social situations? It has been for me. So I am asking from experience. When I was a sales rep and I knew about wine and spirits, it was like telling people I was a sorcerer. It was a conversation starter. So I'm interested. You have taken a lot of steps that I think a lot of other women in comics haven't. And have you been able to use food and wine? And obviously, we're specifically talking about spirits. Have you found that as a medium to make inroads, to make footholds, conversation starter with people? Because I find that so much of entertainment runs on let's get a drink.
Right. I don't feel like I have any specific examples of how drinking whiskey has been beneficial to me, but I will say there is a great book that came out a couple of years ago called Whiskey Women. And it was about the history of women in whiskey and how women were originally those who were making whiskey. Like there's a great, especially in Ireland, Scotland, a lot of these distilleries were very much founded and impacted by the women who were behind the scenes and running those distilleries. And it was their recipes. It was how they were going about doing this business. And they were incredible businesswomen. And there's in that book, they had an example of an ad from some newspaper of someone looking for a wife. And it was like, must be able to do this, this, and this, and must make whiskey was one of the examples of what you needed to do to be a good wife. So there is definitely a long history of women in whiskey. One of the other great things in that book was about during Prohibition, how women were often the whiskey runners because it was illegal it was illegal for police to search women because that wasn't proper. However, of course it happened, and terrible things happened, but it was generally a lot of women were running whiskey at that time because it was a little bit safer to be a woman out there, and you were able to hide it under your petticoats. And it's a really interesting history of women in whiskey. So I think there was certainly a shift, as with many industries that happened during the industrial age, of like, oh no, now everything's the man's job because women shouldn't have jobs. But there is just such an interesting history of women in whiskey. And I think there are a couple distilleries that are now either owned or the head distiller is a woman, that are kind of bringing back that history. And really, it is an interesting way of, I think, women have a different view on spirits in a lot of ways. And not to say that men are traditionally just out to get drunk, but there's a certain contingent of, that sort of like, oh, you just want more alcohol, more alcohol, more alcohol. There's a certain contingent of like the masculinity of being able to really feel the burn and have the idea that that's what you're looking for, is a sort of tolerance to pain and tolerance to something not tasting good. Whereas I think women are a bit more refined in the way that they go about their spirits.
Well, that's the perfect segue, as if I had told you, because one of the things that I do want to talk about is sort of the role of spirits in a social sense, and how it plays across our industries, and also how it's evolved for us. For people who've seen other episodes of this, I'm always here to say, in college, I was not a cultured person. I was just looking for that Keystone Red can and turning upside down to drink things out of a nozzle or whatever that word is, because I'm a writer. And that changed when I got into distribution. I started to know the story of every bottle, and probably more so because I was working for a craft spirits importer. I got to know the passion behind what was in the bottle, and also the thinking around how and when to drink it. I think I obviously have my own perspective, but how has yours changed, over time? And also, I'm fascinated, you'd already sort of teed up a lot of the differences even within the industry, a given industry, between the sort of social roles and points of view of the centers around spirits. I had previously someone say, as I alluded to earlier, that he views drinking as you are making an offering to the other person. You are sharing a moment with them, whether it's a cocktail, whether it's a bottle that's special to you. Obviously, when it's gone, it's gone. So the idea is sharing a bit of something finite with something else. And that all sounded very romantic and special. So here, the question is, having said what you said about the differing views on drinking and things like that, is that complete bullshit? I'm interested, how's your view of it evolved, or have you seen it change even from industry to industry? Spoilers to people who've read your bio. I'm sure it plays a different role in your former life doing roller derby than it does in animation. And those types of contrasts are really interesting to me and the viewer. So that's what I wanted to ask you about next.
Well, starting out, I grew up in a very religious home. There was no alcohol at all, no exposure to alcohol at all growing up. So I didn't have any sort of basis coming into, what is the difference between a whiskey and a tequila? I couldn't have told you. Like I had no idea growing up, any of that stuff. And for me, what really started getting me interested in different sorts of spirits and wines and beers and things was traveling. It was always, I think, the first time my husband and I went to Ireland was 2007. And we did the Jameson tour and all that. And that was just so enlightening and, really interesting. And that was probably the first time I ever drank whiskey at all. So that's definitely travel has been my gateway into learning about different spirits. We love to do all the wine, especially in California. It has such great wine tours that you can go on and really having that experience. So I think the experience of travel is often really integral to my experience with different whiskeys and whatnot. And I think that experience, especially if you're drinking something new, something unique, like, are you drinking a Rioja in Spain, or like anything that's origin specific is so wrapped around the travel experience for me. And, it's even with like going to different Comic Cons, there's always some craft brew there that's, at the local bar that everybody is tasting. And I think that's really so much of the experience for me. I feel like, in a way that maybe, given some of the conversations around BeerCon and all those things, I feel like animation definitely as an industry is much further removed from that sort of bar mentality. Whereas certainly as a comic book professional, so many of those networking opportunities are really around the bar and what bar you're going to after you're done it with your panels or whatever. So I wouldn't specifically say that there's any real points in animation where I feel like those two parts of my life have crossed much, but certainly more within the Comic-Con world. And like having purple hair, if you're a girl drinking whiskey at a bar, that gets you some attention, I guess. So I think there is a certain amount of conversation that, whether wanted or not, we can discuss that later, is going to happen in those kind of convention spaces.
Without a doubt. I mean, BarCon is exhausting. This would have been let me see. This would have been my 23rd San Diego Comic-Con in a row had it happened this year. And I think it was 4 years ago, like I make myself sound like an old man. I was 31 and I was already like, you know what? Every night I'm going to bed by 12:30, no matter what. And so magically at 12:30, I would have to use the restroom and I would just ghost that shit. And it was probably the best decision I made. Like I was actually human the next day. And the thing is too, like I made that commitment to myself once I started being in at DC, because I had, as a kid, because I've been going so long, and this is an interesting track for the conversation to take, but I do think it's a good one. I had been going as a professional only for a couple of years, but as someone trying to break in since I was a little kid. And I remember pros who at the time I thought were just tired, but very obviously were just hungover out of their minds. And when I became a professional, my view of spirits, it did change, but it was the reverse of what many other people might think. I feel like it's our responsibility to be there and be on when we're on,
right.
for our fans. And so that's one of the reasons I made the change I did. And it is interesting, it's not what I expected to talk about with you, but that's how these things always go. Like, I feel like when you go from, I hesitate to say amateur, up and comer. Amateur has a lot of negative connotations, but when you become professional, things that didn't necessarily have a responsibility or the same responsibility to them, I think they change, and that's fascinating. It made me enjoy the time I did have to relax and unwind even more, because it wasn't something I could just do on my own whim. I was there for however many tens or hundreds of, I'm not gonna put myself over on this thing. However many people were there to see me at San Diego, it was my responsibility at any con to be 100% myself when I was there for them. And so it actually made me value the time that I could, at least in the case of San Diego, sit out by the bay or something even more, because it became all the more rarer once I finally got into the industry that I was looking to do for my whole life. So, because you're right, it can get out of hand, and I think that is in some ways a product of this sort of like the way that you view spirits, and there's, if it is something, if it's a means to an end, which is definitely part of toxic masculine culture, then you behave one way. But if it's a moment, which is a lot of things that we've been talking about, well, then you don't want to waste that. It's almost gluttonous.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of that, for me, that original relationship changed when my understanding of what was in the bottle began to evolve, and I've sort of never really looked back. I mean, once in a while, yes, I will have a Miller High Life Light, the champagne of beers, just because. But that's mostly just on principle. So with that said, you are traditionally a whiskey person. I want to taste the spirit. I'm not going to assume anything. This is not a whiskey, it's a cognac. Have you had cognacs before? And the answer, of course, might just be yes. But
I have, but not regularly and not in like a official tasting setting. It was like hey, look, there's a cognac on the menu. Let's order that.
well, this is like a very unofficial tasting. For folks that are watching, we are tasting the Jackie Navarre VA Reserve today. This is, a spirit that they're both real. It's like holding up the newspaper. A spirit that has been with PM for as long as I have, if not longer, and it's just one of my favorite things. I think it embodies everything that PM Spirits is about. This is not me as a salesman, me as a spirits fan is more the answer here. Because it's a product of as few human hands as possible. It's a family that has been making cognac for 4 generations, going back into the 1800s. And there's almost nothing done to it. That's the beauty of it. Because of the humidity where they barrel and where they rest, it's 90 proof spirit. It's almost 50 years old, but there's been no water added to it ever. So you really have something that is as simple and pure of an expression as you can possibly get when it comes to grape spirits. And this is the only cognac that this producer brings into the U.S. He brings some other stuff that is in the dessert part of the portfolio but this is it. A 50-year-old cognac from start to finish are usually around there. VA Reserve only has to be usually above 30, but in this case it's a little older. And I certainly feel a little older being above 30. And I'm just excited to try it. You're doing the right thing by having it on a rock, so I applaud you.
I was going to ask. I was like, oh, I didn't look it up beforehand. I should have.
No, you actually are. I've said it before. Like, one of the things when you do overproof bottlings is you want to have it on a rock, at least in contrast to having it neat, because when you have it meet water, it'll open up flavors that weren't necessarily there when it's closed and hasn't mixed at all. So I was actually excited to see you try it on the rock. So with that said, you haven't had a cognac and taste like this. What is on your mind?
It has like a great hazelnut on it and some floral to it. It's really good.
Is there stuff you think, like I sent it to you having
very smooth,
and which can be surprising with it being 90 proof. But I agree, and I think that it pleases me. I mean, I would never send someone something that I don't think they would like, although it's never 100%. But I think cognac, because of a lot of mass production, and there's nothing wrong with mass production, I'm not here to shade that. There's something beautiful about regularity and reliability in the spirit. But I think oftentimes folks tend to write off brandies in America because a lot of big brands have painted one picture of it, but that's really only one facet of what a cognac or an Armagnac can be. So I'm excited to have you as a whiskey drinker try this and be able to connect with it, because I think there is a lot of similarities, although of course I would probably consider whiskey a little bigger in the mouth. Your type of oak is different and things like that. But this compared to sort of like what you would get out of a whiskey, are you finding some things that do connect between the two, flavor-wise, mouthfeel-wise? I'm not going to hit you too hard, but those are my questions.
Yeah, I would say flavor-wise, it is within sort of the same flavor profiles. Let me taste it again. It does have some like great fruit on it, like some pineapple or something.
No, absolutely, especially because you put it on the rocks like a professional.
Oh, it's yeah, I would say it does have a lot of that same sort of thing if you were looking for a whiskey, and I would probably say it would even do well in a lot of the sort of mixed drinks that you would do. You could substitute this for whiskey, but you wouldn't want to do that because that would drown out all the great flavors that you have here. It's really interesting and changing as you keep opening it up.
And also, like, you're actually totally right too. Like cognac old fashioned, cognac Sazerac, cognac Manhattans, all things that I've uh, certainly done, including with this bottle. So like, I think going into sort of cocktail applications where you normally have whiskey is the next step with a lot of spirits that behave similarly. And I think you're right on. And I think it's fascinating because you do get, the thing you said to me when it comes to liquors that is interesting is you were saying, oh, if you have Rioja in Spain, like the travel and the memory is part of the deal. And I think you're absolutely right, by the way. Like I would even go further and argue that that same bottle would not taste as good if you had it in your backyard as it would in the moment.
There's a psychology term that I heard someone use on a podcast once called the rosé effect, where the same bottle of rosé that you had in Provence is never going to be as good anywhere else. Like the people order rosé, they're like, oh, we had this at this great little winery. And then they're like, this isn't the same thing. And they're like, yeah, it's exactly the same thing you drink, but it's just not the same setting. It's so much of what we taste is so much setting and memories and moments.
It's the same for me in the movie Super Troopers. I've only watched it once, but I was going to like it in after having my wisdom teeth pulled, and it's never going to be as funny as that moment. So I can just never watch it again. But I think you're absolutely right. And what I was going to sort of bring this around on the topic of this sort of exploring things together, sharing moments together, is one of the things that I think is special about spirits because the ingredients are simple. I mean, this cognac it's made from grapes and water and time. And time is, I think, the big X factor that is really fascinating. Time is how you build something unique into a bottle. So yes, I think that travel is a huge aspect. I would go further because I'm a huge nerd and say that when you have a spirit that is made by hand like this, that has spent this time in the bottle, in a way, you are tasting a moment in time. You are tasting those 50 years. So it's almost like through this, you can time travel through your palate. Like I'm not going to say we're jumping in the TARDIS here, but it's fascinating to me because yes, the factors that affected this barrel are never going to come again in exactly the same way. And even the same release, even the next release is going to be different because it'll be a different 50 years. So I'm always interested to see where these conversations are going to go. But for me, it seems like this idea of travel is almost what the heart of this conversation has been about. You are exploring the world either in person in a way that is affecting your relationship with spirits, or you're exploring the world through them. And you're exploring moments through them. And I think that is something that is really special. And it's one of the reasons that I'm excited to be able to have conversations like this, talk to you, talk to other friends, and sort of see how they relate and orbit around these same concepts. Because, this is 50 years in time in a bottle, and you and I can taste and talk about it. And obviously two other people, completely different conversation on the same time. So I'm just happy we could talk. I'm happy we could taste this together and people could find out a bit more about your world, your industries, what's up and coming. So with that in mind, before we wrap up, like as always, where can folks find you and what's next?
You can find me at Shea Fontana on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I am lucky that I am the only Shea Fontana in the world, so I have all the domains. And as far as what's next, I am under NDA on a lot of projects, working on some new animated series. Beyond that, I've been working as the head writer on Polly Pocket, which is on Netflix right now. And you'll be seeing a few more seasons of that coming out on Netflix. And it's a lot of exciting things in the works. And I'm excited to travel with you through this bottle, even though we can't actually go anywhere.
It's the perfect way to travel for the pandemic.
Yeah, it's the 2020 way to travel. It really is.
Well, yeah, I
You
mean,
have to get a. I do have a practical question for you. As a person who has been, I assume, drinking this same producer and cognac for a while, do you taste any specific differences from year to year?
I think that, obviously the producer has a ton of experience with producing cognac, so there is a lot of regularity. But that said, absolutely. I think that for me, the differences in the bottles of Navarre play out. The flavor profile tends to be somewhat uniform because they are pulling from the same fields when it comes to growing the grapes and so forth. But I taste the difference usually in tannins. I taste it, which is sort of the mouthfeel, and I taste the difference in how it opens up, as you were saying. That to me plays out variations on the same theme, as I guess is what I would say. Because you have a master of his craft making this bottle, but you still have different environmental conditions, different growing seasons, and so the way that the fruits play out, and also the way that the tannins break down to me is different with every release. It's where I see it, being a former spirit sorcerer, as I said. But no, you're right. It's exciting, and this is the best way to travel in a world where getting a haircut or going to the grocery store is a wild time. Like, that's a wild Tuesday
Yeah.
now. So I truly appreciate you coming on, and hopefully, when the world comes back, we can touch base on this stuff in, in person. I miss LA a lot. As someone who's raised and lives in the Northeast, I miss it more in January when I usually have my annual visit. But hey.
Well, you wouldn't miss it right now. It's just hot and smoky from all the fires, so it's not the best right now. You're better off.
I did see it was like 117 or something last weekend, which is pretty, even for LA, that's a bit much. I wasn't sad to be in New England at that point, that particular time. So I hope you're keeping safe. I thank you again for coming on and being part of this series. We're just happy to introduce your world to our world and everyone out there. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Cheers.